Alright. So today, guys, I want to talk to you about one of my favorite openings, the Modern Benoni. Now, this opening is an opening that I used a lot when I was a junior coming up. On my way to becoming a chess master. I liked it because it gave a lot of dynamic play and tactical opportunities which fit, my lion style. So I thought that I would share or give you guys an overview of the ideas of these openings from the standpoint of somebody with a lot of experience, and also to see if you guys would like it for yourselves to try it out. In this series, there's going to be a series of videos where I'm going to explain the different ideas in this modern Benoni, and then later down I'm going to go into specific variations, but I want to show you guys these different ideas and then see if you guys can take a liking to this opening as much as I have. All right, so first of all, let me just show you guys what the opening is. So the opening goes like this: it's d4, nf6, c4, c5, d5, e6, chipping away at the center, knight c3, e takes, c takes, d6, e4, g6 to fianchet the bishop, knight f3, that's going through some random moves, bishop e2, and castle. And now we have our modern Benoni structure and setup. Now, this comes from d4, c4, and c5. d5. There's also another move order in which you can get it from as well, where after d4, c4, black can go e6. Sometimes going for the Nimzo or Bogo Indian. But after knight c3, you can just play c5. And after d5, you get a direct transposition into the Benoni. So those are the first moves of the opening. Now I want to talk about the pawn structure of the opening. Alright, so this is the pawn structure. In any opening, it's very important to understand the soul of the position. And that usually comes from the pawns. The pawns are the soul of chess, right? Now, understanding the structure will help you to understand the plans that you're supposed to be playing for. So let's just take a look at the structure from Black's point of view, right? Now, if we look at the structure on the queen side, most of Black's pawns are on the queen side. Now, why this is important to know is that if you understand that most of Black's pawns are situated on the queen side, you'll understand that his plan has to do with expanding on the queen side. And I'm going to show you how this is beneficial just from this structure. So if you play, so let's just say b5, c4, b4, c3, what you realize is that as a result of thus advancing the queenside pawns, you create a pass pawn to go down the board and queen, right? Understanding that fact helps you to know how to arrange your pieces in order to go for that plan in the future to get maximum advantage from the structure. Another thing I also want to point out is what's the ideas for white. So here, white's most advanced pawn, right, is the pawn that is on d5. Now, if white, just to give an idea, if white is to play e5 here, what happens is that white directly attacks the d6 pawn, which poses a question to the d6 pawn. If the d6 pawn does nothing, then white will just, of course, take the pawn, and then he goes down to glory himself. Or if black takes this pawn, then all of a sudden you realize that this pawn starts marching down because that pawn will be out of the way. So with that in mind, white's idea is to push forward on the king side and the center, right? With the idea of playing f4 and e5 for that same reason. So white has to arrange his pieces to go for those kinds of plans. Now, another plan for black based on the structure is to play pawn to f5. Now, the reason for this, when more pieces are on the board, right? Of course, it wouldn't be great because pawn push would create a pass pawn instantly. But with pieces on the board, right? What this pawn does a very good job of doing is protect this pawn. So if the black pawn moves up here and attacks this pawn, and this pawn gets removed, then this pawn here becomes very, very weak because it would be by itself, right? So that's why this f5 move is a typical idea for black in these types of structures as well, once you understand that that's the basis of it. Now that I've discussed the opening and the structure, let's get into some concrete ideas. Alright, so here is a typical position arriving from the modern Benoni. Now here, knight to a6 is a typical plan. The reason why you want the knight on a6 is you want to maneuver the knight to c7 in order to support the plan of going b5, expanding on the queen side as I had said earlier. Right? So f3, knight c7, pawn to a4. White typically plays pawn to f4 so that black can never think about playing pawn to b5. But as we know, it's one of the main plans for black. So black has to insist that he try to get in that b5 break to expand on the queen side. Pawn to b6. Eventually thinking about playing a6, b5. If he went a6 immediately to try to go for that plan with b5 at some point, what white can do is do a clamping move, a5, which stops b5 ideas because white could then just go en passant and take the pawn. So that wouldn't be good for black. So pawn to b6, knight c4, and now a very important move here is played for black, which is bishop to a6. Now, something for you guys to understand about the Benoni is that typically in the Benoni, the light square bishop usually has no role or active things that he can do within the structure. So if you look at the bishop before now, right, it didn't have very good squares for it to go. It couldn't go here, couldn't go here, couldn't go here, couldn't go here. So the only good places for the bishop would have been like d7, and it's not that active on d7. So typically in the Benoni structure, we try to trade off the light square bishop so our pieces have more freedom, or we don't have to worry about what we're gonna do with the light square bishop. But here, the knight being on c4 is a good piece. So it makes sense for black to go for bishop a6 in order to trade for the knight, and then go for a6 b5, as we said is one of the main ideas for black. So bishop g5, h6, bishop h3, bishop takes c4, bishop takes c4, and a6. The same thing we were discussing before. Now that the light square bishop is gone, we can focus on our queen side play. So with moves like queen d7, trying to look at the b5 square to go b5, rook b8, trying to go for b5. Everything, the knight on c7 helps to go for b5. Everything is aimed towards b5. As I said to you before, main thing in this structure, if you understand the structure, you understand how to place your pieces and what you're aiming to go for, right? So everything should be along the lines of going for b5. Queen d2, king h7, b1, knight d7, typical in order to go for the e5 square. King h1, rook b8. Finally eyeing to go b5. b4 from white. Pawn to b5. Bishop e2. Pawn c4. And here black has created a passed pawn. The beauty of having a majority on the queen side. Alright, bishop b4, bishop takes, queen takes, and position is quite balanced. But of course, you would prefer black here just because of this great advantage of having the pass pawn. Alright, now let's look at one more plan. Alright, so here, knight c4. So here's another typical position for black in the Benoni. Usually comes from the fianchetto system. So here, this knight is very strong on c4. Eyes the d6 pawn, and also in some lines encourages knight a5, knight c6 if b5 is played too soon. So here in this position, a typical idea for black is knight to b6, trying to exchange this knight for this one. Put this in yellow for this one. And with that trade happening, it helps to free black's position because it's one less piece to worry about attacking its weaknesses. Alright, so here, knight a3. So white doesn't want to exchange pieces here because he has more space. Right? Because white has more space, the more pieces black has on the board is the more pieces that black has on the board is the more black has to think about what he's going to do with his pieces, especially with the limited space that is on the board right now. So we continue our development. Bishop d7. Here we'll put the bishop on d7 so that we in the future can help to support b5. Remember guys, it's always going to come back to b5. Very important pawn push in the structure. Pawn to e4. Just a quick note. If pawn to a5 is played here, then knight to c8 can be played. And we still can go for b5. Right? And if knight c4 trying to go against b5 here, because I would say if we go b5 right now, there's takes, knight takes, and a whole lot of problems due to the weakness here on d6. Right? So that prevents b5. So what we do instead of b5 is we play bishop to b5, still trying to get rid of this knight. And then we can continue with our b5 ambitions. And of course, if the knight takes here, we take with the pawn, and then we achieve the b5, a pawn on b5 anyways. Alright. So here, e4 was played, and not a5. So queen c7, bishop e3, knight c8, and of course renewing our idea of going pawn to b5. We never abandon our ambitions to get in b5 here. Queen to d3, controlling the b5 square so that we can get b5 ourselves. But we have to remain insistent. Knight a7. Renewing our dreams of getting in that b5 push. Knight c4. And now it's time for b5. We'll finally get in that treasured b5 braid that we've been wanting. A takes b5 and knight takes b5. A takes b5 is a problem in this position tactically because of knight takes d6. And unfortunately, our knight is loose on a7, which causes the problems that we have. So that's why we can't take with the pawn. we'll have to take with the knight instead, which is still good because it creates that open file, and also it brings our knight, our passive knight that was on a7, to a much more active position. Bishop to d2. Of course, you must be wondering why rook takes a6 isn't really, well, it's not a good move at all. It's actually a blunder because of knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, and bishop to b5. Attacking both pieces, rook moves, then knight d7, and a lot of problems for white occur because of this pin from the bishop on b5. Knight on e5, knight on b6, and white is in a lot of trouble. Bishop f4, knight b6. But anyways, bishop d2, played. Knight takes, bishop takes, bishop b5, rook e1, knight d7, take, queen g8, king g8, knight a5, and knight e5, going for the c4, the d3 square. Also, in some lines, trying to occupy b4. Rook e3, queen b6, bishop f1, and g5, stopping f4. And here we'll have a pretty balanced dynamic game for black. We'll have pressure down the B line against his pawn. And also we'll have ambitions of going some point pawn to c4, knight d3, and gaining more space on the queen side. Alright, so this was part 1 of our video. If you liked it and you want to learn more about the Modern Benoni, please subscribe and stay tuned for the next part in the Benoni series.